The interactive show on Press TV that tackles the major issues of the week. I'm Roshan Mohammed Salih. In this last show of 2016, we'll be asking one simple question. What is your say on the political events and tragedies of 2016? Over the next hour, we'll be talking to our expert studio guests as well as taking your calls and comments on this issue. You can call me on +44 208 601 4555 to share your views. You can join the conversation on Twitter @thebigconvo_PTV, and you can watch the show live on Press TV's Facebook page, and I promise I'll read out the best comments that you leave on there. But before we get stuck into our discussion, here's a reminder of the three most momentous events of 2016.
Three news events dominated 2016. Britain's decision to leave the European Union, Donald Trump's election as US President, and the Syrian army's victory in Aleppo. On June 23rd, the British people voted 52 to 48% in favour of leaving the EU, in a vote that was seen as a massive rejection of establishment politics. Following the vote, David Cameron stepped down, saying that the country required new leadership. Eventually, the Home Secretary Theresa May took his place. And Scotland's First Minister Nicola Sturgeon said a second independence referendum would be very likely because Scotland voted to remain in the EU. Analysts said that the shock Brexit vote was a rebellion by the working classes and those sick and tired of the establishment. Others said it had unleashed right-wing forces and had left Britain weaker on the international stage. On November 8th, Donald Trump was elected the 45th President of the United States, after a polarizing campaign that took relentless aim at the media, financial and political establishment. The surprise outcome, defying polls that showed Hillary Clinton with a lead, threatened convulsions throughout the country and the world. The results amounted to a rejection not only of Mrs. Clinton, but also President Barack Obama. And it was a decisive demonstration of power by white working-class voters amid decades of globalization and multiculturalism. Finally, last week the Syrian army said that Aleppo had been fully returned to the government control after the last batch of civilians and militants were evacuated from the city. The statement came after the last convoy carrying militants and their families left Aleppo, paving the way for Syrian forces to retake full control of the city. The eastern sector of Aleppo was among the first areas that fell to the Takfiri militants following the outbreak of the foreign-sponsored crisis in the country. Aleppo's liberation is seen as a crushing blow to the militants and their foreign supporters, who have been actively working to topple the Damascus government since March 2011.
Before I introduce my guests and get into your calls, I'd like to say a few words about 2016. For me, 2016 has been about the rejection of the mainstream politics and mainstream media. The Brexit vote in June was driven by working class people in the UK who've been marginalised by the political, financial and media mainstream, who are completely out of touch with vast swathes of the electorate. I personally never voted in a British election before, and that's because I've never felt that there was a party or candidate that represented me. But I did vote for Brexit in June for two main reasons. I wanted to undermine the idea of an unelected, unaccountable European superstate, and I wanted to weaken Britain itself. Now, let me explain that a little bit further. I didn't want to weaken Britain because I hate Britain. I wanted to weaken Britain to stop it causing mischief elsewhere in the world, and so that it would focus internally on its issues, its own issues for once. So in my book, a weaker Britain is actually a good thing for Britain. That said, I am worried about the right-wing forces that Brexit has undoubtedly unleashed, and we have direct proof of that in the increase in attacks on Muslims and foreigners in general. But racism isn't a new phenomenon in this country, and we will continue to fight it. That rejection of the mainstream was also evident in the election of Donald Trump. I'm not a big fan of Trump because of his anti-Muslim rhetoric, his pro-wealthy rich policies and his pro-Israel and anti-Iran bluster, but the fact is that he definitely was the anti-establishment candidate. Practically, the entire financial, political and media establishment lined up against Trump, but he won in spite of those massive odds. So the US electorate was faced with a horrible choice between Trump and Hillary Clinton. And the fact is that she promised more of the same at home, but potentially an escalation in places like Syria. So for all of Trump's faults, yes, I preferred him to Clinton because he represents retrenchment to the United States and less intervention in the Middle East and less confrontation with Russia. Finally, the mainstream media narrative also came unstuck in Syria at the end of the year. For years, all we've been hearing is that Assad will fall, Assad's a war criminal, and the Syrian people don't want him. But after his victory in Aleppo last week, 80% of Syria's population now lives in government-controlled areas. The fact is that President Assad has considerable support in Syria, and even many of those who don't support him prefer him to his enemies because they simply don't want to live under Daesh or Al-Qaeda. And while the mainstream media was shouting genocide in Aleppo, most of Aleppo's actual residents were celebrating the fact that Al-Qaeda and other Takfiri militant groups had finally been defeated. So perhaps I can end on a note of optimism, because today the Syrian government and militant groups have agreed a nationwide ceasefire followed by peace talks. Russia and Turkey, which back opposing sides, will act as guarantors, and Daesh, as well as Jabhat Fatah al-Sham or Al-Qaeda, are not part of the agreement. Could this be the beginning of the end of the Syrian war? I wouldn't personally bet on it, but we can but hope. Now, let me introduce my guest. Marcus Papadopoulos is a publisher and editor of Politics First. He's also an expert on British politics, Russia and the former Soviet Union, as well as the Middle East. Marcus, welcome to today's show. Thanks for coming in. Anything you want to pick up on what I said there, Marcus? How was 2016 for you?
I think it's very important to say that Brexit was the most major event for Britain. Indeed, the Brexit vote was the most significant event in British political history since the Second World War. And I think we can attribute that to two reasons. Number one, immigration, which I don't really have anything else to add. But the other major factor, and it's downplayed a lot, is David Cameron and George Osborne. The way they bullied, the way they bludgeoned the British people, in particular the English people, always meant that that was going to backfire. And the analysis by the Treasury, which stipulated that there would be a decline in investment in Britain and trade in the event of a Brexit vote, was reasonable, was accurate in my opinion. But the way that Cameron and Osborne said that hours after a Brexit victory Britain would go into recession was absolute nonsense. You just can't behave like that. So I think we can say with certainty that immigration and David Cameron and George Osborne caused the Brexit victory.
Marcus, a lot of people are saying that Brexit was driven by the right wing and it's unleashed the forces of fascism. Are you worried about that?
I am concerned that there has been a rise in racist incidents since the Brexit victory, but I would also say this, the British people, in my opinion, are one of the most tolerant in the world. So while I'm concerned about racist attacks on immigrants and indeed even British citizens who are of, for example, Asian origin, I don't believe...
It's not the beginning of a pogrom or anything like that.
No, I don't. I don't believe that is long term, but certainly British society is divided.
Marcus, let's move on to Donald Trump now. That amazing victory by Donald Trump just in November. What do you make of that? Good thing or bad thing?
I said during the election campaign and after it that Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton are loathsome politicians and are loathsome human beings. And I would say this as well, that there is a curious and misguided sense of optimism about Donald Trump. Number one, he's an unknown quantity. Number two, he surrounds himself with neocons, and that's very clear now with the team he's built up. Even if he's genuine about wanting to change American foreign policy to improve relations with Russia, and that's a big if, he will come up against formidable opposition. He will come up against his own party, he will come up against Congress, he will come up against the Pentagon, the CIA, the State Department, various lobby groups on Capitol Hill, for example, the defence lobby, we can call them the war lobby. So I really don't think there's going to be any serious change in American foreign policy.
Before we widen this out to public callers, Marcus, I want your your views on Syria, events in Syria in 2016.
Well, Aleppo has been liberated, and in my opinion, that is the breaking point in the Syrian conflict. Some people were referring to it as the turning point. No, in my opinion, the turning point in the Syrian conflict was September the 30th, 2015, when the Russian military became involved. The liberation of Aleppo is the breaking point. It's very clear now to commentators and also to the terrorists themselves and their backers in Washington, London, Ankara and Riyadh that the Syrian government, the Syrian army will prevail, and we should be rejoicing because President Assad and the Syrian army have been on the front line for the last 5 years fighting against Islamist terrorists, and we should be delighted, as are the people of Aleppo, who are delighted in that they are liberated.
Okay, let's widen this out now and go to your calls. Tonight we're asking you to look back on events in 2016. What are your main political events and tragedies that you'd like to talk about? I'm really going to open up. You can call in and talk about whatever you want to talk about, not just stuff that we've brought up. We have Julian in London. Julian, what would you like to talk about tonight? Go ahead and make your point, please.
Hi there. Man of the Year was Gary Johnson when he said, "What is Aleppo?"
Oh, Gary Johnson, yeah, he was a US politician, wasn't he? Was he a senator or something?
Remember him. He didn't know what Aleppo was, and he was criticised for not knowing what was happening in Aleppo by people who didn't know what was happening in Aleppo. But I think it would have been a welcome change if we'd had an American president who had absolutely no interest in the Middle East.
Well, do you think that president's going to be Donald Trump?
Well, yes, but he's making all friends in the wrong places, as you said, and people like John Bolton and other neocons and hawks. The hawks are surrounding him. Obviously, he was not the first choice, but he was a plan B, and they planned for everything, these warmongers. So they're going to try and use him, unfortunately. I hope he doesn't fall for it, but he's already being dragged into it.
And Julian, I mean, in the last few days, Donald Trump's made some very pro-Israeli comments, hasn't it? He's a bit of, as Marcus says, he's a bit of an unknown quantity. We don't really know what to expect from him. The signs are that he's going to be less interventionist than Hillary Clinton would have been. But at the same time, we're not 100% sure, are we?
Yeah, it's a gamble. It's the unknown entity. I mean, it's been a very strange year. I found myself cheering for things I never thought I would be. I mean, I'm a typical so-called left-winger. I always regard myself as a socialist, but I voted for Brexit, and I thought that Donald Trump might be less of a danger than Hillary Clinton, and I've supported the Democrat candidate in every election that I can remember watching and staying up late all night to watch. I could never dream that I would be thinking maybe the Republican is the lesser of two evils, because they've become as bad as each other now.
Julian, really appreciate your calls. You actually echo a lot of my sentiments because I would describe myself politically as quite left as well. But I think the lines between left and right are being blurred these days. And yeah, I voted for Brexit and I was kind of secretly cheering on Donald Trump to a certain extent. That's my guilty secret. Let's move on to Adam. Adam is also in London. Adam, what would you like to talk about tonight? Go ahead and make your point, please.
What I would like to talk about is the political event in 2016. The man of the year, I will vote Jeremy Corbyn for standing up to this right-wing media and how to destroy the positive agenda to get all people on board as far as political and democratic dispensation is concerned. So bravo to Jeremy Corbyn and John McDonnell for standing up to the establishment. Again, the worst tragedy that has happened in 2016 is the reminiscence of Tony Blair and George W. Bush, their war on terror that has created more terrorists than ever, that has culminated in nation states becoming more right-wing. We haven't Marianne Le Pen, we haven't Nigel Farage with his agenda of Brexit and Britain voted to leave the European Union, and we haven't the worst one, which is Donald Trump winning the president of the free world, United States of America. Somebody who is a bigot, somebody who is a racist, somebody who doesn't know what is happening around the world but know of entertainment and who doesn't even like women to become a president of the United States of America.
I think he does like women, by the way. But yeah, not in the way that you mean, I don't think. Marcus, I want to bring you in on that. Adam was talking about Jeremy Corbyn. Now, obviously, throughout the year, he's been accused of, if not him personally being accused of anti-Semitism, but his party has been called institutionally anti-Semitic. We've had media headlines to that effect throughout the year. But he kind of fought off his critics to a certain extent, didn't he?
I have a great amount of respect for Jeremy Corbyn. Whatever you think of his politics, he remains truly committed to his principles and he will not compromise. Indeed, ever since he was elected to Parliament in 1983, he has not changed his views. And do you know what? There is, generally speaking, a low level of calibre in British politics at the moment, on the government benches and on the opposition benches. And I do believe that Jeremy Corbyn is a breath of fresh air. And I would even say about Margaret Thatcher and her government, whatever you thought about their politics, those were serious politicians. They were big hitters and they did not compromise their views. And we should applaud Jeremy Corbyn for not compromising his views and for standing up against mainstream media.
Very briefly, Marcus, because I want to get the other callers in. Is he a strong leader, though?
I think in the last year, Jeremy has become a stronger leader. He showed determination, he showed grit. He's not only up against the Conservative Party, he's not only up against a right-wing media, which dominates British media, he's also been up against his own party, the Parliamentary Labour Party. He's still here, he's still going. I think that shows that there is strength in character in Jeremy.
Yes, definitely. He surprised me, but at the same time, I think that you know, there is a dichotomy there, isn't there, between his own parliamentary party, the Labour Party membership and the leadership, which isn't easily resolved if he's going to become Prime Minister in a few years' time. Let's go to, staying in the UK now, we have Damien in Manchester. Damien, what point would you like to make tonight? Go ahead, please.
Well, thanks for having me on. Well, in the last year, we've seen a lot of the world, a lot of the governments go ultimate right-wing with. We have the UK, we have Theresa May, she's really right-wing, that's going to be bad. And then now we have Donald Trump in less than a month, which is going to be bad for America. But the good thing is that it might wake people up a bit. They say the night's always darkest before the dawn, but maybe this will just shake the world up again and making people realise that this can't go on much longer. The way people are getting treated. Like, look at the UK, there's people committing suicide because of benefits and different things. And in America, you have Flint and Detroit, and it's only going to be so long before the straw breaks the camel's back.
I mean, Damien, where does this leave the left? Because, as you say, we have a right-wing Prime Minister in Britain, we have a right-wing President in America, perhaps next year in France we're going to get a right-wing President, either Marine Le Pen or François Fillon. Is the left, is it being sidelined?
No, I don't think so. I think that the left just need to, well, you don't, it's not even people that's not left, but moderates as well. You have to just stand up together and say enough is enough.
Yeah.
We've seen how the rise of fascism has went down in the past, and it raises its ugly head every now and then, but every time it'll get slapped down because they're all cowards anyway.
Sure. Okay, Damien, I really appreciate your call. Let's move on. All our calls from the UK so far today. We have Colin in Leeds. Colin, we're talking about the political events and tragedies of 2016. Please go ahead and make your point.
The biggest event has got to be Trump winning the 2016 presidential election. It's significant for two main reasons. One reason is that it's probably the last stand of white supremacy. So whether he lasts 4 years or 8 years, a candidate going for white supremacy will probably never rule America again. And it's also significant because it will mean the Democrat Party will have to really work and become quite responsive and possibly more left-wing to occupy power in 4 or 8 years.
Do you think so? I mean, Trump kind of won on the back of this right-wing working-class vote, but you're saying the Democrats are going to lurch to the left. Isn't it more logical that they might lurch to the right to get back those voters?
Well, they were kind of, centre-right party anyway, but they always represented the sort of establishment, and the fact that they've gone for someone outside of the establishment who is far right will mean they kind of have to offer practical work and welfare-related incentives to oust him. That's my opinion. If you think about Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren, these are the names that are being touted to come back in 4 years. I mean, Hillary Clinton is absolutely done, and I think
she's not going to run again, is she? She'll be about 80, won't she?
Politicians who are centre-right in America, they're kind of finished because they want a fresh voice, they want a change candidate. So even though it might be bad for 4 or 8 years, I think in the long run it will be a positive outcome.
Thanks for your call today, Colin. Let's go to Farouk, also in London. So far, all our calls from the UK today. Let's have a few calls from around the world if we can possibly get it. Farouk in London, go ahead and make your point, please.
Yes, good evening to you. Now, the thing is, it seems something that's been missed altogether by the West mainstream media is what's happening to Yemen. The poorest Arab country, is being bombed to smothering. Whereas, it seems like, Muslims have lost the ability of talking to each other. And the main thing that comes into play is, just bomb them out of existence.
Yeah.
And I think, the United Nations gone missing on that bit as well. Although limelight is very much on Syria and the rest. Thank God that's coming to an end. But I don't know about Yemen, how soon can the Saudis stop bombing the place, where innocent people, like anywhere else, where there's a war, it's always the innocent that pays for the brunt of the whole thing.
Yeah.
So just hope, let's look at 2017, and hopefully that Saudi will come to some kind of, I don't know, some kind of sense, come back to the senses in the sense, like, and start looking things in a more positive manner in order to come some kind of agreement between the two parties.
Okay.
So that,
all right, thanks a lot, Farouk. So you want to focus on Yemen. Marcus, just a brief reaction from you there. I mean, no one's talking about Yemen, are they?
I think Farouk makes a very, very pertinent point, and it demonstrates, or Britain's policy towards Saudi Arabia demonstrates its murderous nature. And what I find extremely frustrating and quite annoying as well is the way you have British politicians saying to sort out the conflict in Yemen, we have to get the Saudis and the Iranians to agree to something. Yeah. It's almost as if Britain has no actual role in the conflict in Yemen. Well, I'm sorry, no Britain, there would be very little chance of having those sort of civilian casualties which we are witnessing at the moment in Yemen. Britain is actually part of the problem.
It's their war, isn't it?
Absolutely. They are the ones who are arming Saudi Arabia in order for Saudi Arabia to prosecute the war. And of course we heard recently that Britain has been supplying Saudi Arabia with cluster bombs, which of course is prohibited.
Let's go to the big conversation wall, because I think we have some Twitter and Facebook slides that we can just have a look at. Marcus, if I can ask you to lean back slightly so I can see the video screen. Sky Data, Public's 2016 predictions as of December 2015. Brexit likely. Brexit was only 23% likely. Unlikely 57%. Cameron resigns, likely 8%. Unlikely 82%. Trump likely 7%. Unlikely 84%. So that proves that the British public know absolutely nothing about what's going to happen in the world. Let's go on to the next slide. Hopefully we can get that quickly up. Pat Condell, with Brexit and Trump, 2016 turned out to be the best year politically that I can remember. If 2017 is half as good, I'll be happy. So just think it proves how polarised people are, doesn't it? In terms of, Pat's happy, but a lot of people will be unhappy that Brexit happened and Trump. Let's move on to the next slide if we have it. Shaheen, if you're alive, you're blessed. Even Muhammad Ali and Fidel Castro couldn't survive this 2016. Yeah, unfortunately, a lot of people, I think the focus in the Western media is on celebrities dying, but obviously when it comes to press TV, Muhammad Ali and Fidel Castro were the people we want to concentrate on. And finally, James Raymond, 20 UN resolutions against Israel in 2016, one against North Korea and one against Iran. UN is an anti-Semitic organisation. All right, so James Raymond is obviously a pro-Israel fan. Obviously here at Press TV we're not, but never let it be said that we don't present the other side of the opinion. Okay, I think we have to now go into a short news break. Tonight we are asking about your views on the greatest political events of 2016 and tragedies that you'd like to talk about. We are going to be back in a few minutes. Please don't go away.
Russian President Vladimir Putin says the Syrian government and foreign-backed militants have signed a ceasefire deal which will take effect at midnight. He also says the two sides have agreed to start peace talks. Meanwhile, Syria says it will end its military operations except those against Daesh and al-Nusra Front terrorist groups. Iranian and Russian foreign ministers have welcomed Syria's ceasefire deal, which will take effect in a few hours. In a phone conversation, Mohammad Javad Zarif and his Russian counterpart Sergei Lavrov also demanded the fight against terrorism continue in Syria. The UN envoy for Syria also hailed the truce. Russia says its embassy in Damascus has been targeted by a mortar shell. The Russian Foreign Ministry said the blast caused no casualties. The embassy was hit by shells twice on Wednesday. Moscow says the attacks are a provocation aimed at derailing a truce deal, which is in the works in Syria. Russian security forces have arrested 7 suspected terrorists in Dagestan Republic. Russia's intelligence agency said the group was plotting a series of high-profile terrorist attacks in Moscow on direct orders from a senior Daesh commander in Syria. Russian security forces seized a large cache of weapons and bomb-making materials. People across Iran are marking the 7th anniversary of mass rallies held in support of the country's Islamic establishment. The nationwide demonstrations on December 30th, 2009 put an end to months of post-election riots. The demonstrators also slammed Western interference in Iran's internal affairs. Nearly 50,000 Rohingya Muslims have escaped to Bangladesh from an army crackdown in Myanmar. Dhaka says the refugees have taken shelter in Bangladesh since early October, when violence against them escalated in Myanmar's Rakhine state. Bangladesh summoned Myanmar's ambassador to express deep concern over the continued influx of Rohingya refugees. China has condemned the new Japanese defense minister's visit to a controversial war shrine in Tokyo. The Chinese Foreign Ministry accused Japan of hampering Beijing's reconciliatory moves and called on Tokyo to, quote, adopt a responsible attitude. South Korea also summoned Japan's envoy over Tomomi Inada's visit to the Yasukuni shrine. Boko Haram has dismissed Nigeria's claim that the Takfiri group has been flushed out of its last stronghold. A video purportedly shows Boko Haram leader Abu Bakr Shekau claiming that the terrorist group has not been defeated. He also accuses Nigerian President Muhammadu Buhari of spreading lies about the army's gains.
Welcome back to The Big Conversation. In this last show of 2016, we'll be asking one simple question. What's your say on the political events and tragedies of 2016? You can call me on +44 208 601 4555 to share your views. You can join the conversation on Twitter at @thebigconvo_PTV, and you can watch the show live on Press TV's Facebook page, and I promise I'll read out the best comments that you leave on there. Now, 2016 has also been a year of tragedies, from the horrific terrorist attacks that have been taking place in the Middle East and the West to the deaths of Muhammad Ali and Fidel Castro. Here's Ahmed Caballo with more.
2016 has been a year soaked in tragedies. Iraq has been yet again devastated by car bombs, suicide bombers, and the ever-imminent threat of Daesh. Terrorism, which was practically non-existent prior to 2003, claimed over 12,000 lives in Iraq this year alone. Sadly, 2016 was the year in which terrorism spread its devastating reach to new places like Burkina Faso, Ivory Coast, and Belgium. And it revealed its dirty face in similar places like France, Turkey, and the US. In France and America, it's paved the way for the growth of far-right nationalism, and even an attempt to ban the burkini. 2016 was also the last full year in office for Barack Obama, America's first ever black president. Sadly, it's been marred with even more disappointment, as it was another year in which Guantanamo Bay remained open, and another year in which African Americans have been shot with impunity by the police, often caught on camera. Finally, 2016 was also the year in which we got to say goodbye to two heroes. The world's greatest Muhammad Ali and Comandante Fidel Castro both took heroic stance against the might of American imperialism, and 2016 will be remembered as the year they both left the fight undefeated.
Last night I had a dream. When I got to Africa, I had one hell of a rumble. I had to beat Tarzan's behind first for claiming to be the king in the jungle.
Marcus, just picking up on a few things from that report. Now, obviously, terrorism gets a lot of publicity when it happens in the West, but most terror attacks are actually happening in places like Iraq and Syria, aren't they?
Absolutely. And who are the victims? Overwhelmingly, they are Muslims.
Yeah.
And the root of it is, of course, Western foreign policy, because no matter how despicable, how monstrous these terrorists are, they would be almost nothing if it wasn't for the support which they receive from Washington and London. Remember, the Americans and the British have a long history of supporting Islamist terrorists. They started in Afghanistan with the Mujahideen against the Soviet army. They continued it during the Bosnian Civil War, and then Libya, and then Syria. So, as I said, even though these terrorists really are just monstrous, truly, utterly horrific people, they would not constitute that potent threat to people's everyday lives if it wasn't for the support which they receive from the West.
Yeah, I mean, just by destabilising these countries like Syria and Iraq especially, it kind of gives them a space to work in, doesn't it? It's a vacuum of, that they fill.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Yeah. It opens the door to them. And, you know, in Syria, the Americans and the British are using Islamist terrorists to achieve a geostrategic objective, which, of course, is the overthrow of the Syrian government. Why? Because the Syrian government pursues an independent foreign policy and is pro-Russian. And the Americans and the British know that if Russian influence ends in the Middle East, vis-a-vis Syria, then American dominance of the Middle East will be cemented.
Marcus, I mean, do you think the attacks that we're seeing in the West, do you think they're in a way, I'll call a spade, are they blowback for Western foreign policy?
Absolutely, there's no question about it. The fact that the Americans have been feeding the terrorists in Syria and also in Libya, let's not forget that. It was inevitable that there would be blowback, and many of us said this at the beginning of 2011 when the West started supporting those Islamist groups fighting against Colonel Gaddafi in Libya. We knew that it would open the doors to terrorist attacks in Europe, and it would strengthen the terrorist threat posed to Europe, to North Africa, to the Middle East, and to the wider world in general.
But I think as long as it's not an existential threat to the West, they'll probably continue these policies. I mean, terrorism is an existential threat to places like Iraq and Syria, but it's not. It's like a problem that they can deal with at the moment. But I want to move on to a few other big stories. We saw that the great Muhammad Ali died, passed away in 2016. 2016. I understand you're not a massive boxing fan, so I won't ask you too much about him. But I will ask you to comment on Fidel Castro's passing. What's the significance of that and his legacy?
Well, Fidel Castro was a source of inspiration to hundreds of millions of people around the world. He brought back Cuba's independence. You know, prior to him coming to power under Batista, who was an American stooge, Cuba really was an American brothel, full of business people, full of crooks, all the sort of wrong people were ruling Cuba. But Castro, he liberated Cuba. He gave the Cuban people back their respect. And you know, are there problems in Cuba today? Well, of course there are. Every country has problems. But you know, as a result of Castro, in Cuba, there is guaranteed housing, there is guaranteed employment, there is free healthcare, which is one of the best in the world, and there is free education. And yes, while there is an issue with human rights, the origins of that is the threat posed to Cuba by the Americans. And of course, the Cuban government does have to take sometimes, you know, restrictive measures because they feel threatened by the Americans.
I mean, every country in the world that's under threat will restrict freedoms to one extent or another.
Absolutely.
You can't really judge those countries until those threats are lifted.
No. And, you know, I wish that people around the world would understand the devastating effect that American sanctions had on Cuba. Yet today, Cuba remains free, and the Cubans are extremely proud people, and we should be delighted in their success.
Okay, I want to get as many calls as possible in during the second half of the show. Saeed is in Southampton. Saeed, we are talking this week about the momentous political events and tragedies of 2016. What would you like to say, Saeed?
Oh, what? Hi, Roshan.
Hello.
Hi. Well, for me, is after so many wars in our world, in planet Earth, since, not going back so many years, since Second World War II, we still see, you know, the establishment which we call UN is still the same in favor of Americans and UK and French. And really, the people of the world have to force their governments to put sanctions, engineer sanctions against Americans and British and French, mainly Europeans, to overhaul and change UN and have a fair system in order to stop these tragedies for human beings or people in the world, like imposed war on Iran, and supporting these terrorist monsters in Syria, Yemen, Libya, in Vietnam, and so many of them. And we know, as history says, Americans have killed so many people since the Second World War and still continuing. We have to stop this.
Okay,
and we need people like Jeremy Corbyn and yourself and so many of them.
Saeed, I get your point. I'm going to cut you off simply because I want to move on. Briefly from Marcus, I mean, do you see a realignment in international affairs now? I mean, Saeed was talking about you know, the hegemonic powers, the USA, Britain and France. Do you see a move away towards perhaps Russia and China and the global south, or not?
Yes, I do believe that. I believe that the days of Western supremacy are coming to an end, though America will remain a formidable power.
For a long time.
We shouldn't underestimate that. But of course, it's not going to be like how it was in the 1990s when Russia was on its knees. Russia had gone into meltdown. You know, that was then, this is now. So I do believe that there's a more balanced situation on the international stage, mainly because of Russia, but also China and India as well. So I think that while the world is plagued with problems, the fact it's more balanced gives cause for optimism.
Okay, back to your calls. We have Mo in the UK. Mo, you know what we're talking about tonight, about 2016. Go ahead and make your point, please.
Hi, Mr. Saleh.
Hello.
I need to focus on a couple of points. The first one is Jeremy Corbyn. He spoke about the illegal Iraq war in the House of Parliament, but he left the building to go to another building to apologize for the illegal war. And I think we need Jeremy Corbyn to explain why did he not apologize for the war in the chambers, in the Parliament chambers where the illegal war votes took place.
Do you think that's significant, Mo? Is that are you nitpicking there, or why is that so significant? I don't understand.
Very, very significant. It's what it does is it ties the House of Parliament to a bad decision because the leader of the opposition apologizes for the illegal war. It is a very significant move, and that's why Corbyn deliberately did not apologize in the House, because it brings it into disrepute. And that is not what he should have been concerned about.
Well, what's your second point, Mo?
He should have been concerned about 1 million people.
And you wanted to make a brief second point, did you, Mo, or not?
I do. I want to talk about these, you remember the Christmas terrorism attack? A Polish man was found in the cab of the truck. Yes, the man who was accused of the...
in Berlin, yeah.
Yeah, in Berlin. He was killed in Italy. But if you see Charlie Hebdo and if you see all these attacks in Nice and what have you, none of these guys are caught on the scene, but they all seem to be killed in a shootout. And believe me, if they are the actual perpetrators of those horrible attacks, they should be brought to justice and not be murdered. Because I think...
What are you suggesting, Mo? What are you suggesting?
I'm saying these are false flags. These are not. This is an innocent man who was murdered in Italy.
Would you agree with that, Marcus, or not? Was that a conspiracy, what Mo is saying?
I think we need to hear what the police investigation discovers. Ideally, of course, terrorists should be caught alive because they need to be interrogated. However, I think it's simply too early to determine what exactly happened.
So you're ducking that question, basically. Sitting on the fence there, Marcus. Let's go to Asad in Texas. I think our first call from outside the UK today. So I'm glad to welcome you, Asad, to the show. What would you like to say?
Hey, thank you very much. Greetings, everybody. Very interesting here to see, as far as a person who's not into politics and tries to be neutral, he sees that, the wrong was very easily proved and the right was really, really hard to prove this year when it comes to the East or the West. You see the general idea, like all, basically the whole empire. You see what principles and what advertisement it does and human rights and whatnot in their own codes, they are failing, so there is no escape. And this is something really nice for the normal people, humanity as a whole. It's like winning again. Like, there is a hope which is coming, but it's so strong, if you come to see the truth, it's so hard. But, if you see the truth, for example, the JCPOA, that was such a success. It was so hard, it was so strong. And, finally something proved. And even the same part in Syria, where Russia, China, and everybody, whoever is it, basically a whole world war, which is being fought. But again, it's not advertised as the world war.
So, Asad, I think you're a glass half full kind of guy. Two bright spots there. I'm kind of a glass half empty kind of guy, so I think Assad is balancing me out. Two bright spots there, perhaps the Iran nuclear deal. We've yet to see what will happen with Donald Trump's attitude to that, so I think the jury might be still out on that. And a note of optimism there about events in Syria. Perhaps the Syrian war might be coming to an end. Let's go to Canada now. Mark is online from Toronto. Mark, what would you like to say?
I just wanted to point out everything that happened, every political event that happened this particular year in 2016. I would like to say that I found that many contradictions going on here, because you see sometimes relations such as the Russian-Turkish relations that are full of contradictions, and I'm not getting it. Somehow I don't know what's happening, because when you see what happened recently with the murder of the Kremlin ambassador, you see the reactions of Turkish, Russian politicians put So you would see sometimes Putin being pro or help or, wanting to get closer to Turkey, same with Erdogan, and sometimes it's the complete opposite. And it's almost, close to worlds.
Mark, maybe Marcus can help you out there. I mean, I think what you're describing is geopolitics. It's a complicated game, and there are nations that strategically might have different priorities, but occasionally they might have to work together because they need each other, because maybe they have a trading relationship, or over a particular conflict they might have the same interests. Marcus, maybe ask you about that. I mean, Turkey and Russia, last year they seemed to be mortal enemies. Now they're doing deals.
A lot happens in politics behind closed doors, which the public will not find out about. But the reality for Russia is that Turkey is not going anywhere. Turkey's not going to disappear off the map. And secondly, Turkey has been backing the terrorists in Syria, be it ISIS, al-Nusra, and the so-called Free Syrian Army. And Russia has to deal with Turkey and is dealing with Turkey behind closed doors. But please, no one should think that because Russia is having to work with Turkey, that's a sign of Russian weakness. Not at all. Russia has the leverage of power over Turkey, over Erdogan. Let's not forget it was Erdogan who flew to St. Petersburg and gave a profuse apology to Putin for the shooting down of the Russian plane. Now, that really says it all. And yes, the assassination of the Russian ambassador in Ankara, it was heinous, and we need to see what the Russian investigation produces. But Russia, in my opinion, has Turkey where it wants, and no one should be under an illusion that Russia working with Turkey demonstrates a weak Russia. On the contrary.
Okay, so I think we have some time left in the show, so let's get as many calls as possible. Costas is in Cyprus. Costas, I'm going to give the airtime straight to you. What would you like to say?
Well, first of all, I want to compliment you on your new series. And wish you luck on it.
Thank you.
And the most important, the most tragic thing that's happened in Syria, and the way I see things today, thank God that Russia intervened, because today Mr. Erdogan says that it is obvious that the USA is supporting terrorists. They have been doing that for some time in Syria. It seems that it seems that now it has come to light. Of course, the USA was using Turkey to help them in moving shipments of arms to the terrorists. So Mr. Erdogan is not lying by saying that the USA was helping the terrorists.
but so was he. Yeah, they both were. Okay, Costas.
They both were. But the tragic thing is that this terrorism now is everywhere in Europe.
Yeah.
What America has done, it's irreversible.
Costas, I agree with you. It is everywhere in Europe, but to be honest, it's more everywhere in the Middle East. And personally, if you count the body bags, it's a much more severe and existential problem to a lot of states in the Middle East than it is to Europe, where, hundreds of people do die, and that is heinous and wrong and horrible. But it's nothing compared to the suicide bombings you see every day in Baghdad markets, killing people, and that never gets reported. Howard is in Boston in the United States. Howard, what point would you like to make tonight?
First of all, I'd like to apologize for the previous foreign policy of the United States. Number one, I think I've been telling people that Donald Trump would be to the United States what Brexit was to the English. But the fact is, our problems go back to 1953, when British Petroleum went to the Eisenhower administration to do away with Mossadegh in Iran. That was the beginning of our problems. And then your other caller mentioned about Afghanistan. We got involved with that. And all I can say is Tony Blair and George Bush, as far as I'm concerned, are responsible for the thousands of body bags brought back to their families in both England, Scotland, and the United States. I'm angry about it. Unfortunately, most Americans have literally got to listening to the news from overseas. I have happened to spend time in Moscow at the Kremlin a few times, and I've traveled around the world a bit. Unfortunately, for the rest of the world, most Americans are not tuned in to what's happening. I was at a conference and I tried to explain to people that we have to learn to understand the other side, the caliber of what we're dealing with. That's why we made a huge mistake for Blair and Bush in Iraq and the WMDs and all that nonsense. I'd like to hear your comments.
Okay. Howard, very eloquent point, lots of fantastic points, which I would normally discuss in detail, but I'm not going to today because I want to get a few of the Facebook comments in that you have been leaving. People have been watching us live on Facebook, and you've been leaving comments on our Facebook page. Let's get a few comments in if we can go to the big conversation wall. Nikki Hancock, Marcus, addressing this to Marcus, what do you think of the inappropriate comments made from the CARES president in the US about the dead Russians in the accident of the doomed plane in the Black Sea? I'm not sure whether you followed this, Marcus. Oh, you do. So this was a guy who represents a Muslim organization in America, and he was basically saying that he wished more Russians had died.
Absolutely disgusting, and that reflects the views of someone who has no principles, no morals, and the fact that he calls himself a Muslim, well, I think is just completely ironic, because of course Islam is not Islamism. Islam is a religion of peace, and this man carries with him the label of being a Muslim, and I think he should be ashamed of himself. And I think, in my opinion, anyone who makes a comment like that should actually be taken in for questioning by the police, because that is demonstrating extremist credentials.
Okay, and I think we have one more Facebook slide. Okay, we don't have any more. So I'm going to ask you, coming to the end of the show now, Marcus, looking ahead to 2017, what do you think the trends that are going to be, they're going to play out?
Well, I sincerely hope 2017 will be a better year than 2016. I hope there will be a move towards global peace, towards global security. I sincerely hope there will be a fundamental change in American foreign policy, though I don't believe so. I hope that Russia continues to regain its Soviet-era influence and continues to claw back its lost superpower status. And, of course, I really hope that every inch of Syrian soil is liberated by the Syrian Arab Army.
Okay, Marcus Papadopoulos, really appreciate you coming in today and kind of giving us all the benefit of your erudition. Okay, that's all we've got time for today. Thank you to our guests and to you for calling into the show and sending in your comments. We'll be back next year with more on whatever is the biggest talking point of the week. And all I can say is I hope everyone that watches this show has a happy and peaceful new year. Goodbye. See you again in 2017.